I was halfway through a glass of champagne at my sister's engagement party when her fiancé looked straight at me and said, "Heliocor only hires the best. The final round is brutal. You probably wouldn't even make it past security." The table erupted in polite laughter. My mother covered her smile with her napkin. My father shook his head in that familiar way he used to when I talked about renewable grids and venture capital instead of real jobs with real benefits. Across the candlelit table, my sister Lily squeezed Ryan's arm proudly, as if he had just delivered a clever punchline instead of a quiet insult. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell them that 3 months earlier, after the largest merger in Heliocor Systems history, I had been appointed Chief Executive Officer of the newly formed parent company. I didn't mention that Monday morning at 9 sharp, I would be sitting at the head of the executive conference table conducting Ryan Mercer's final interview. Instead, I smiled. Because the cruelest part wasn't what he said. It was that my entire family believed him. The engagement party was being held in a private rooftop room overlooking the Chicago River. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline in gold and blue. String lights were draped across exposed beams, and a violinist in the corner played something soft and sentimental that made everything feel curated and perfect. Lily was glowing. 29, polished, poised, the picture of stability. She worked in human resources for a major Chicago corporation and wore her success like a well-tailored blazer. In my parents' eyes, she had chosen the sensible path. Salary, structure, benefits, a retirement plan. I had chosen a rented garage in Denver and a stack of unpaid invoices 12 years ago. Ryan was holding court now, one hand wrapped around a crystal glass, the other resting confidently at the back of Lily's chair. He was 31, ambitious, and very aware of his own reflection in the window behind him. He had that tone men get when they believe they've already won something. "So, yeah," he continued. 6 rounds of interviews, executive panel, technical assessment. Heliocor's expanding fast in renewable energy storage. They're looking for real leaders." "Real leaders?" My mother turned to me. "So, Peyton," she said sweetly, "how's your little business doing these days? Is it finally profitable?" There it was. Little business. I took a slow sip of champagne. "It's doing fine, Mom." Fine had been my shield for years. Fine when I lost my first major investor. Fine when I had to refinance my condo to cover payroll. Fine when I slept on a folding couch in that garage office because I couldn't afford both rent and engineers. Across the table, Ryan leaned back. "Energy's a tough space," he said casually. "A lot of startups flame out. That's why companies like Heliocor are so selective. They only hire the best." My father nodded approvingly. "That's how it should be." Ryan smiled at me again, half amused. "The final rounds with the executive team. I've heard the new CEO is intense. Total shark. Cleaning house after the merger." A shark. I kept my expression neutral. I had signed the merger papers myself. I had negotiated the terms that protected our employees. I had spent 80-hour weeks in windowless conference rooms making sure Heliocor survived the transition intact. Lily laughed lightly. "Babe, don't scare her." "Hey, I'm just being honest," Ryan said. Then he looked directly at me. "It's not like just anyone can walk in. You'd probably need a badge just to get past security." The laughter came again, softer this time but still there. Under the table, my phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. I didn't need to look to know what it said. Monday, 9 a.m., final candidate interview, Ryan Mercer. I folded my hands neatly in my lap. Years ago, when I told my parents I was leaving a stable engineering position to start a renewable energy company, they called it reckless, dreamy, unrealistic. My mother had asked who would marry a woman who gambled like that. My father had said I should wait until I was older and wiser. Lily, meanwhile, accepted her corporate offer letter the same week. Benefits package attached, defined growth track, applause all around. Every Thanksgiving since then, someone had asked if my small, self-started company was still operating, as if it were a hobby I hadn't grown out of. Ryan was still talking about HelioCore's expansion into grid-scale battery storage. He misused a technical term about load balancing, subtle but wrong. I noticed. I always noticed. My mother leaned toward Lily. "You two are such a power couple," she said warmly. "Ambitious, grounded." I wondered what grounded meant to her. Probably not maxing out credit cards to keep your engineers paid. Probably not pitching to investors who smiled politely and then funded someone else. Ryan raised his glass. "To the future," he said. "To the future," everyone echoed. I lifted my champagne as well. Because the future, at least for Ryan Mercer, was going to look very different in less than 48 hours. As dessert plates were cleared and conversations shifted to wedding venues, I excused myself quietly and stepped out into the hallway. The noise of the party dulled behind the heavy wooden door. I pulled out my phone. There was a message from my assistant in Denver confirming Monday's executive schedule. I opened a new text to HelioCore's HR director. "Please send me the complete candidate file for Ryan Mercer tonight. Full background. Include compliance notes and external communications." I hit send before I could second-guess myself. This wasn't about a smirk at a dinner table. It wasn't even about being underestimated. It was about protecting the company I built from a garage into one of the fastest-growing renewable energy firms in the West. And if Ryan Mercer believed Monday morning would be his victory lap, he had no idea whose chair he was about to stand in front of. The flight back to Denver was delayed by 40 minutes, which gave me just enough time to replay every word Ryan had said at that table. "They only hire the best. You probably wouldn't make it past security." It wasn't the arrogance that lingered. I've negotiated with men far more dangerous than a 31-year-old with a tailored suit and a rehearsed grin. What lingered was my parents' silence, the way they hadn't flinched, the way the insult had felt logical to them. By the time the plane finally lifted into the night sky, the sting had cooled into something steadier. Not anger. Focus. When I landed in Denver, the air was dry and sharp. My driver asked if I wanted to go straight home. I nodded. It was nearly midnight by the time I stepped into my house, dropped my suitcase by the door, and walked directly into my office. The lights of the city shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. On my desk, 2 monitors waited in the dark. My phone buzzed. Candidate file ready. Full executive packet attached. I didn't hesitate. I powered up the screens and opened the secure portal. HelioCore Systems. 12 years ago, that name had been scribbled on a whiteboard in a rented garage outside Denver. I had maxed out 2 credit cards to pay for early prototypes. I had pitched investors who smiled indulgently and told me renewable storage was too volatile for a female founder's first venture. I had watched competitors with less efficient technology and better connections raise twice the capital. 3 months ago, after a complex merger with a West Coast grid infrastructure firm, I had signed documents that placed my name at the top of the executive letterhead, Chief Executive Officer. The title still felt heavier than I allowed myself to admit. HelioCore was no longer fragile. We held federal contracts. We were expanding battery storage deployment across multiple states. Every executive hire now carried weight that could ripple across thousands of jobs. Ryan wasn't applying for some mid-level analyst role, Director of Grid Optimization Strategy, a position that would sit directly under the VP of Infrastructure and influence how we modeled peak load distribution across new battery facilities. I opened his file. The resume was polished. Clean layout. Strong verbs. Led. Spearheaded. Optimized. Rapid promotions over the last 5 years. Cross-functional leadership. Midwest Storage Initiative oversight. At first glance, impressive. But something tugged at me. I zoomed in on the Midwest project he claimed to have led. I knew that project. We had analyzed their public data during merger discussions. The firm credited in his description had not been the primary architect of the optimization framework. Another engineering group had been. Red flag. I scrolled further. Projected ROI improvements listed in bold percentages. No external validation attached, no third-party benchmarking, just confident numbers floating without anchors. Confident numbers always make investors nervous. I had learned that the hard way. Then I saw it. A bullet point referencing a proprietary optimization approach that used terminology slightly off from industry standards. Close enough to impress a non-technical interviewer. Wrong enough to stand out to someone who had built the original modeling architecture. I leaned back in my chair. Buzzwords. Polished surface. Limited depth. My inbox pinged again. Compliance attachment uploaded. I opened the additional file. At his previous company, Ryan had received a formal advisory notice for misrepresentation of contribution during a grant proposal submission. Not termination. Not public scandal. But documented. Language in the memo read, candidate exhibits strong persuasion skills, but requires clarification in role attribution. Clarification in role attribution. That was corporate for took credit where credit wasn't his. I wasn't surprised. I was disappointed in myself for not being surprised. I requested expanded documentation. Within minutes, legal responded. There is an external communication flag associated with this candidate. My fingers paused over the keyboard. External communication flag? I opened the attached screenshot. 3 weeks earlier, Ryan had messaged a minority HelioCore shareholder on LinkedIn, looking forward to joining the executive leadership team soon. I understand how important alignment at the top is. Excited to contribute. He added a line implying familiarity with internal perspectives and referenced having family connections within the company. He had not named me, but the implication was obvious. He was manufacturing proximity to power. The shareholder, to their credit, had forwarded the message to our internal governance inbox with a note, unusual outreach from candidate. Thought leadership should be aware. I felt something shift in my chest. This was no longer a story about a man puffing his chest at a dinner table. This was a man attempting to create leverage inside a hiring process. HelioCore's governance policies were clear. Any attempt to influence board members or shareholders outside structured channels triggered compliance review. He had gambled that no one would check. He had gambled that confidence would carry him through. I considered recusing myself from the interview. On paper, it would be the cleanest option. Avoid appearance of bias. Let the executive panel proceed without me. But the compliance note from legal followed quickly. CEO presence recommended due to sensitivity of external outreach. There it was. Not sister, not jealous relative. CEO. I reopened his practical case study submission. He had outlined a grid-scale lithium storage deployment across 3 states with aggressive load balancing projections. On the surface, it was ambitious, but the modeling assumptions were shallow. He relied heavily on generalized industry benchmarks without accounting for HelioCore's specific battery chemistry architecture. Anyone who truly understood our system would have asked about degradation curves under variable temperature fluctuation. He hadn't, because he didn't know. The clock on my desk read 2:17 a.m. I closed the shareholder email and stared at the skyline. For a brief moment, I saw Lily's face at the engagement party. Her pride, her certainty. Did she know he reached out like that? Did she understand the risk he was willing to take for optics? I pushed the questions aside. My responsibility was not to protect her fiancé's ego. It was to protect thousands of employees who trusted HelioCore's leadership to make disciplined decisions. I opened my calendar and edited Monday's agenda. Add technical deep dive, energy storage degradation modeling. Add ethics scenario question regarding external communications. Request legal observer present in room. No casual executive handshake. No friendly conversation about long-term vision. An audit. I shut down one monitor and left the other glowing softly in the dark. Ryan Mercer believed Monday morning would validate him. He believed he was walking into a room to be welcomed. He had no idea he was walking into a room prepared to examine every line he had written. And for the first time since the laughter at that rooftop table, I felt something close to calm. By 8:45 on Monday morning, I was already seated at the head of the executive conference table on the 42nd floor. The glass walls overlooked downtown Denver, the mountains faint against a pale blue sky. The room was silent except for the low hum of the air system and the soft clicking of my COO's pen. Legal sat to my right, HR to my left, laptops open, files aligned. At 8:58, the intercom buzzed. "Mr. Mercer has arrived." My COO glanced at me. "Ready?" I didn't need to answer. "Send him in," I said. The door opened exactly at 8:59. Ryan walked in with the same posture he'd worn at the rooftop dinner, shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted, confidence calibrated for performance. Navy suit, perfect tie knot, polished shoes that clicked once against the marble threshold. "Good morning," he began smoothly. "Ryan Mercer, it's an honor to—" He saw me. The sentence dissolved midair. For a split second, all color drained from his face. His eyes flicked from me to the nameplate in front of my seat, then to the others at the table, searching for context. He recovered quickly. I'll give him that. "I didn't realize you worked here," he said, forcing a half smile. I didn't smile back. "I'm Peyton Caldwell," I said evenly, "Chief Executive Officer of Heliocore Systems. Welcome to your final interview." The title settled into the room like weight. He hesitated before taking the chair across from me. His movements were smaller now, less theatrical. Legal adjusted her glasses. HR began typing. Ryan cleared his throat. "Well, this is unexpected." "Unexpected doesn't mean unprofessional," I replied. "Let's begin." I opened his file. "Mr. Mercer, your resume indicates primary leadership on the Midwest Storage Optimization Initiative at Grid Axis Energy. Can you walk us through your modeling assumptions for peak load redistribution under seasonal variance?" He blinked once. "Absolutely," he said quickly. "We focused on agile load balancing frameworks to ensure scalability across variable demand curves." "Specifically?" I asked. He leaned forward. "We implemented a dynamic reallocation protocol that allowed us to adjust battery output based on real-time grid analytics." "Which algorithmic structure did you use?" I asked. "Iterative scaling or recursive adjustment?" A pause. "We, adapted an iterative model with recursive elements," he said. "That's vague," my COO noted quietly. Ryan's jaw tightened. "It was customized to fit infrastructure demands." I nodded once and tapped my keyboard. His case study submission appeared on the screen behind me. "In your written assessment," I said, "you referenced a proprietary optimization framework. The terminology you used doesn't align with standard lithium degradation modeling. Can you clarify your understanding of degradation curves under temperature fluctuation?" His eyes shifted briefly to the screen, then back to me. "Of course," he said, though his voice had thinned. "Degradation is primarily influenced by cycle frequency and discharge rates." "And ambient temperature?" I asked. "Yes, that too. Quantify it." Silence. He swallowed. "It depends on external conditions." "Which is precisely why we model them," I said calmly. Legal remained silent, but her presence was felt. Ryan adjusted his collar. "Let's shift," I continued. "Your file includes a formal advisory notice from your previous employer regarding role attribution on a grant proposal. Would you like to explain that?" His composure cracked slightly. "That was a misunderstanding," he said quickly. "Internal politics. My contributions were minimized." "The advisory indicates you overstated your leadership involvement," HR said without looking up. "It was clarified," he insisted. "Clarified," I repeated, letting the word settle. I clicked again. The shareholder email appeared on the large screen. 3 weeks ago. Time-stamped. LinkedIn message. Ryan went still. "Mr. Mercer," I said evenly. 3 weeks ago, you contacted a Heliocore minority shareholder and implied executive alignment through family connection.
Would you care to explain? His breathing changed. That was networking, he said. Completely normal in executive environments. You referenced internal perspectives, I replied. Perspectives you did not possess. I was expressing enthusiasm, he snapped. Legal leaned forward for the first time. Our governance policy prohibits direct outreach to shareholders during an active hiring process. You were informed of this policy in your candidate briefing. He looked from her to me. I didn't think it applied in that context. Which context? I asked quietly. He hesitated. The context where you believed your engagement to my sister gave you leverage? I asked. He flinched. I never said that. You implied it, I said. The shareholder forwarded your message to our internal governance inbox. His confidence evaporated in visible increments. That's being blown out of proportion, he said. I was trying to show initiative. Attempting to create perceived insider influence undermines the integrity of our hiring process, I replied. He leaned back suddenly. This feels personal, he said. You're my fiancé's sister. I am the CEO, I said, and this interview is governed by fiduciary responsibility. Silence filled the space. He looked smaller now, not physically, but in presence. The performative certainty from the rooftop dinner was gone. You're overreacting, he said weakly. Everyone networks. Not like this, Legal replied calmly. I closed the file. HelioCore does not hire candidates who misrepresent credentials or attempt to influence governance channels, I said. The interview is over. The words landed without drama. HR typed something final into the system. Ryan stared at me. You're humiliating me, he said. No, I answered evenly. I'm enforcing policy. He stood abruptly, gathering his folder with hands that no longer felt steady. As he reached the door, he turned back. You're going to regret this, he said under his breath. I held his gaze. I regret nothing that protects my company. Security escorted him out quietly. The door closed with a soft click. For a moment, no one spoke. My COO let out a slow breath. That's a no, then. That's a no, I confirmed. Legal closed her laptop. Compliance flag has been added internally. I nodded. Outside the glass wall, Denver shimmered under the morning sun. 12 years ago, I had begged investors to take a chance on a woman with a prototype and a stubborn vision. Now I was the one deciding who earned a seat at the table. My phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and again. I didn't need to look to know who was calling. Ryan might have walked out of this building defeated, but the real confrontation was just beginning. By the time I stepped out of my afternoon strategy meeting, my phone screen was a wall of missed calls. Lily, 6 times. Mom, 3. Dad, twice. And one unknown Chicago number I didn't need to guess. I stood alone in the hallway outside the executive wing, the Denver skyline glowing through the windows, and let the silence stretch for a moment before unlocking the screen. The first voicemail was from Lily. What did you do to him? Her voice was tight, breathless, not confused, accusing. The second voicemail was shorter. He said you ambushed him. A text followed. How could you humiliate him like that? I closed my eyes briefly. So that was the narrative. Ryan hadn't lost an interview. He had been attacked. Another voicemail. This one from my mother. Peyton, we're just trying to understand what happened. Ryan is devastated. He said you brought up personal matters and threatened him. That doesn't sound professional. Threatened him. The word settled heavily. I didn't threaten him. I enforced policy. But in the story he was already constructing, policy probably felt like persecution. My phone vibrated again, Lily calling. This time, I answered. What did you do? She demanded before I could speak.
I conducted an interview, I said calmly. That's not what he said. Of course it isn't, she exhaled sharply. He said you blindsided him, that you made it personal, that you brought up our engagement like it was some kind of liability. I leaned against the cool glass wall. I asked him about his ethics advisory and a shareholder message. Silence. He told me that email was just networking, she said. It was an attempt to imply executive access. I replied. That violates governance policy.
You could have handled it privately, she shot back. You didn't have to destroy him. Destroy him? That word hurt more than the accusation. I didn't destroy him, Lily, I said quietly. He disqualified himself. She scoffed. You've always hated that I have stability. There it was. Jealousy. The old script. You think this is about us? I asked. He said you seemed bitter, she said, like you wanted him to fail. For a second, I saw us at 16 and 19. She had the prom crown. I had a regional science award. Our parents framed her photo first. Back then, I swallowed it. Now, I didn't. This is about Heliocore, I said evenly. It's about protecting a company I built. You could have recused yourself, she snapped. I considered it. Then why didn't you? Because legal recommended my presence due to the shareholder outreach. She didn't respond immediately. I could almost hear her thinking, recalibrating, choosing which version of the story to trust. Before she could answer, another call came in. Mom. I'm merging you, Lily said abruptly. The line clicked. Peyton, my mother began, voice controlled but edged with disappointment. We're trying to understand why you'd mix business with family like this. I almost laughed at that. Dad's voice joined. You should have stepped aside. That's what ethical leadership looks like. Ethical leadership. I inhaled slowly. Ethical leadership is enforcing policy equally. He's ambitious, Mom said. Everyone embellishes resumes. I felt something inside me shift. Embellishment is different from misrepresentation, I said. And contacting shareholders during an active hiring process is not embellishment. You're exaggerating, Dad replied. You're justifying hurting him. Hurting him, not risking federal contracts, not undermining governance, hurting him. Is this about you feeling overlooked? My mother asked quietly. That landed harder than Ryan's insult ever had. Overlooked. I thought about 12 years of holiday dinners where my work was summarized as still trying, about the way my father introduced Lily with her corporate title and me with a shrug. No, I said steadily. This is about integrity. Lily's voice cut back in. He said you smiled when you dismissed him. Yes, I said. There was a pause. I smiled because I was calm, I continued, not because I enjoyed it. Are you even sure you're ready to be CEO? My mother asked softly. The question wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. For a moment, the hallway felt smaller. I could have listed the merger details, the negotiations, the late nights, the investors who trusted me. Instead, I said, yes. Silence. I did not reject him because he's engaged to you, I said carefully. I rejected him because he attempted to influence our hiring process and overstated his credentials. You're making this bigger than it is, Dad insisted. No, I replied. I'm making it exactly what it is. Lily's voice came back, thinner now. He said you seemed jealous. I let that sit between us. If I were jealous, I said quietly, I wouldn't have built a company worth more than the one he just lost. The line went silent. I hadn't meant to sound sharp, but sometimes truth cuts. I need proof, Lily said finally. I'll send it, I replied. The call ended without goodbye.
I stood there for a moment, staring at my reflection in the glass. For 12 years, I had stayed quiet to keep peace. I had minimized my achievements so no one felt uncomfortable. But silence, I was realizing, doesn't protect relationships. It protects false narratives. Back in my office, I opened my laptop. I attached the official press release announcing my appointment as CEO 3 months ago, the merger summary, public documentation, a redacted version of the compliance note regarding the shareholder email. I stared at the email window for a long moment. Once I sent this, there would be no returning to small self-started company Peyton. Subject line, for clarity. No commentary. No emotion. Just facts. I hit send. Within minutes, the read receipt appeared. No reply. Outside my window, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting Denver in gold. For years, I thought staying quiet was strength, but now I understood something different. If I didn't tell the truth, someone else would keep telling theirs. And by morning, one version of me would solidify in my family forever. The question was, which one? I woke before sunrise and reached for my phone before my eyes were fully open. No missed calls, no new voicemails, just one unread message from Lily sent at 8:12 the night before. Is this real? That was it. No accusations, no anger, just 3 words that felt heavier than all the shouting from yesterday. I sat up in bed and stared at the ceiling for a moment before calling her. She answered on the second ring. "Tell me it's not fake," she said immediately. "It's not fake," I replied. There was a pause. I could hear traffic in the background, Chicago morning noise filtering through her window. "I Googled it," she said. "The merger. Your name. There are industry articles, press coverage. You're listed as CEO.
3 months ago. Yes. 3 months, she repeated quietly. I couldn't disclose it before the official announcement, I said. Board confidentiality clause. You know how that works. I didn't know, she said softly. I didn't know any of it. For the first time since Monday, there was no accusation in her voice. Just something like disbelief. "Why didn't you tell us after?" she asked. I leaned back against my headboard. "Because I was tired of explaining myself." Silence again. "I thought you were struggling," she admitted. "Ryan said your company was barely keeping the lights on." I almost smiled at that. Heliocor had closed a merger valued in 9 figures, while my family assumed I was scraping by. "I wasn't struggling," I said. "I was negotiating." She exhaled slowly. "I feel stupid." "You're not stupid," I replied. "You trusted someone you loved." There was a rustling sound, like she was shifting positions. "He told me the ethics notice was just internal politics," she said. "He said everyone gets something like that when they're rising too fast." "Did he tell you about the shareholder message?" I asked. "No," she said immediately. "He said it was just a congratulatory note." It wasn't. I could hear the change in her breathing, slower, heavier. "Did he know you were CEO when he sent it?" she asked. "No." That detail hung between us. "So he was implying executive access without even knowing," she said. "Yes." Another long silence. By midday, the silence didn't last. Ryan had clearly shifted into damage control. Lily called again, this time more agitated. "He says you fabricated part of the compliance note," she said. "He says companies exaggerate things when they want someone out." "Companies don't fabricate internal governance reports for entertainment," I said evenly. "He also got another offer," she continued quickly, like she needed to prove something. "A senior strategy role at a clean energy firm here in Chicago. He showed me the letter." "I don't doubt he interviewed elsewhere," I said. "He said he didn't even need Heliocor," she added.
I almost laughed at the irony. That's his narrative to control, I said. It doesn't change what happened. He said you seemed satisfied when you dismissed him, she said again, like the detail still bothered her. I was calm, I replied. There's a difference. There was a soft thud on her end, like she'd dropped into a chair. I confronted him about the email, she said after a moment. And? He said it was strategic outreach, that you're overreacting because you're protective of your company. I didn't answer immediately. She asked him why he didn't tell her. She continued quietly. He said it wasn't important. That was the crack. Not the ethics notice, not the job rejection, the omission. He said if I trusted him, I wouldn't question it, she added. I closed my eyes. That wasn't ambition. That was control. Before I could respond, my inbox pinged. A short statement from the HelioCore shareholder confirming the LinkedIn outreach and its escalation to governance. I forwarded it to Lily. Within minutes, she texted. He never mentioned this. I imagined her reading it in her kitchen, the neat corporate language, the timestamp, the quiet finality of documented fact. He's saying you're twisting this because you've always resented him, she said when she called again. I don't resent him, I said. I evaluated him. He keeps saying you can't separate business from family. I can, I replied. That's exactly what I did. Another silence. I don't know who I'm marrying, she said finally. The words were barely above a whisper. You don't have to decide today, I told her. There was a small sound, like she was wiping her face. Mom and Dad want to go ahead with the formal engagement dinner Saturday, she said. They think if we all sit down and talk it out, it'll smooth things over. Of course they did. Normalcy as damage control. He's planning to make a speech, she added, about resilience, about overcoming internal politics. I could almost see it, the polished smile, the narrative repositioning. And you? I asked. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to believe him. The other part keeps hearing that word you used. Integrity, I said. Yes. I stared out my office window at the Denver skyline, the afternoon light sharp against glass towers. For years, I had wanted my family to see me. Now they were finally looking, and it was uncomfortable for all of us. If what you sent me is true, Lily said slowly, then this isn't about jealousy. It's about who he is. It is, I said. And if that's true, she continued, voice shaking slightly, then Saturday isn't going to be a celebration. No, I agreed. It won't. When we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. This was never about revenge. It was about whether the man my sister was about to marry could be trusted with something as small as a hiring process. If he couldn't handle that with honesty, he wouldn't handle a marriage with it either. Saturday night was going to force that truth into the open, and this time, it wouldn't be behind glass walls in a boardroom. It would be in front of our entire family. The private dining room at the Chicago hotel was already half full when I arrived. Soft gold lighting washed over linen-draped tables. Crystal glasses caught the glow of chandeliers overhead. A long arrangement of white orchids stretched down the center of the main table, like a carefully curated promise of perfection. It looked like a celebration. It felt like a stage. Ryan spotted me before I reached my seat. His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. Then the smile returned. Polished, practiced, unwavering. Peyton, he said warmly as I approached. Glad you could make it. Wouldn't miss it, I replied. Lily stood beside him, composed but not radiant. Her eyes flicked toward mine briefly. There was something unsettled there. Not panic, not certainty, just awareness. My parents greeted me with careful politeness, no sarcasm, no comments about small businesses, just quiet nods and stiff smiles. Dinner began with controlled conversation, weather, venue options, work updates that skimmed the surface without depth. Ryan didn't wait long to reclaim the narrative.
So,
He said, lifting his glass halfway through the main course. It's been an interesting couple of weeks. Several guests laughed lightly. Corporate politics can get messy, he continued. Sometimes ambition intimidates people. He didn't look at me, but the implication hovered clearly in the air. I've decided, he added, to accept a senior strategy role with North Star Renewables here in Chicago. They value innovation over ego. Applause broke out around the table. My mother exhaled in visible relief. My father clapped once, firmly. Lily smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. Ryan continued smoothly. Sometimes when doors close, it's because you're meant to walk through better ones. Better ones? He raised his glass. To resilience. To resilience. Several voices echoed. He set the glass down and leaned back slightly, confidence restored. And to integrity, because in the end, integrity always wins. That was when I stood. The movement was small, calm, deliberate. I'd like to clarify something, I said. The room quieted immediately. Ryan's smile faltered just slightly. This isn't about ambition, I continued evenly. And it isn't about intimidation. I let my gaze move slowly around the table. Ryan was not rejected from Heliocore because he's engaged to my sister. He was rejected because he misrepresented his professional contributions and contacted a company shareholder during an active hiring process. A soft murmur rippled through the room. Ryan straightened. That's not... I held up a hand, not sharply, just enough. The message to the shareholder was forwarded internally and documented. Our governance policy prohibits that kind of outreach. It had nothing to do with family. My father blinked. Shareholder. Ryan's voice sharpened. It was networking, perfectly normal. Not during an active executive interview process, I replied calmly. Legal wasn't here. HR wasn't here. But the facts didn't need witnesses. I didn't attack him, I said. I asked him to explain documented inconsistencies in his resume and the shareholder message. Ryan's composure thinned. You're twisting this. You're using your title to control the story. I'm using documentation, I said. The room was completely still now. Lily slowly turned toward him. Did you tell me about the shareholder email? She asked quietly. He hesitated. It wasn't important, he said quickly. It was strategic outreach. Her eyes didn't leave his face. You didn't tell me. It didn't matter, he insisted. It mattered to Heliocore, I said evenly. And it matters now. Ryan's voice rose slightly. You're making it sound like I committed a crime. No, I replied. I'm making it sound like you attempted to influence a hiring process. He looked around the room, searching for support. My mother looked confused. My father stared at his plate. Lily's hands were resting on the table, fingers curled slightly inward. Did you exaggerate your role on that Midwest project? She asked him. Another pause. I highlighted my contributions, he said. That's not what I asked, she replied. Silence stretched. For the first time that evening, Ryan didn't have a prepared sentence ready. You're choosing her over me, he said finally, frustration bleeding through. I'm choosing facts, Lily said. The air felt charged, fragile. Ryan leaned forward. She's always resented me. I almost smiled at the predictability. No, Lily said quietly. You resent her. That landed harder than anything I could have said. Ryan stood abruptly, chair scraping lightly against the floor. This is ridiculous, he snapped. You're blowing this out of proportion. I asked one question, Lily replied. And you believed her immediately? He demanded. She reached up slowly and slid the engagement ring off her finger. The diamond caught the chandelier light as she placed it gently on the table between them. No dramatic throw, no raised voice, just finality. I believed the documentation, she said. The room seemed to shrink inward. Ryan stared at the ring like it had betrayed him. You're making a mistake, he muttered. Maybe, she said, but it won't be based on a lie. He looked at me then, anger simmering beneath the surface. You win, he said. I shook my head slightly. This isn't a game. He didn't respond. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and walked toward the door without another word. The door closed softly behind him. No one spoke. The orchids in the center of the table looked suddenly artificial. I remained standing for a moment before sitting back down. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Across the table, Lily was staring at the empty space where he had been. My mother's voice trembled slightly. Lily. Lily didn't look away from the door. For years, I had been the uncomfortable presence at family gatherings. Tonight, the discomfort belonged to someone else, and for the first time, no one was laughing. The door closed behind Ryan with a soft click, and for a moment, no one moved. The orchids in the center of the table suddenly looked too white, too perfect, like props in a scene that had gone off script. Silverware rested untouched beside half-eaten plates. The violinist in the hallway outside kept playing, unaware that the celebration had collapsed inside this room. Lily was still staring at the empty doorway. My mother was the first to speak. Lily, is this true? She asked quietly. Not, why did you do that, Peyton? Not, how could you embarrass him? Just a question directed at her daughter. Lily swallowed hard. He didn't tell me about the shareholder message, she said. My father looked up slowly. Shareholder, he repeated, as if the word itself felt foreign. I kept my voice even. He contacted one of our minority shareholders during an active hiring process and implied executive access through family connection. Dad blinked. He said that? He implied it, I said. Lily let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. He told me it was just networking, she said. He said you were overreacting because you're protective of your company. Small company. I felt the old phrase echo in my chest. For the record, I said quietly, I am protective of my company. The room fell silent again. Lily turned toward me then. Her eyes were red, but steady. Did you ever want him to fail? She asked. It was such a simple question. It deserved a simple answer. No, I said. She studied my face, searching for something. I didn't reject him because he's your fiancé, I continued. I rejected him because I've spent 12 years protecting HelioCore from people who overpromise and underdeliver. Integrity isn't optional. Lily looked down at the ring resting on the table between us. He told me you were barely keeping the lights on, she said softly. That your company was hanging by a thread. My mother's head snapped toward me. That's not true? She asked. I met her eyes. No, I said. 12 years of polite understatement had trained me to minimize my answers. Tonight, I didn't. HelioCore wasn't hanging by a thread. It was expanding into 3 additional states. It held contracts that required precision and discipline. It was stronger than it had ever been, but strength had always made my family uncomfortable. Lily rubbed her temples lightly. I liked being the responsible one, she admitted. The stable one. It felt safe. I felt something soften inside me. I never hated you for that, I said. She looked up quickly. But did you resent me? I thought about every Thanksgiving where my startup was treated like a hobby, every holiday where Lily's promotion was toasted and my funding round was dismissed as risky. I resented the comparison, I said honestly. Not you! That seemed to land differently. My father cleared his throat. We thought we were protecting you, he said to me. From failure, from risk. I didn't ask to be protected, I replied. My mother looked almost fragile. We didn't understand what you were building. That was the first time she had said the word building. Not trying, not experimenting. Building. I didn't push for more. I didn't need to. Lily reached for her water glass but didn't drink. Her hand trembled slightly. He said if I trusted him, I wouldn't question the email, she said quietly. Like doubt meant disloyalty. I recognized that tone, not in business, in manipulation. Trust doesn't require blindness, I said. She nodded faintly. He minimized everything, she continued. The advisory notice, the resume exaggerations. He made it sound like you were the only one who cared. I care because it's my responsibility, I said. But I would have cared even if he were a stranger. That seemed to matter. The room no longer felt hostile. It felt exposed. After a few minutes, the remaining guests began to slip out quietly, murmuring polite goodbyes that didn't quite fit the moment. My parents stayed seated, still absorbing the shift in reality. Lily stood slowly. Can we talk? She asked me. We stepped into the hallway outside the private room. The violinist had stopped playing. The hotel corridor was quiet, the city lights visible through tall windows at the end of the hall. She leaned against the wall and let out a shaky breath. I don't know who I am without trying to be the right daughter, she said. That confession was more vulnerable than anything that had happened inside. You don't have to compete with me, I said softly. I know that now, she replied. I didn't before. For years we had existed in roles assigned to us. She was stable, I was risky, she was practical, I was dreamy. We both believed those labels because they were easier than questioning them. He said you smiled when you rejected him, she said again, almost to herself. I smiled because I wasn't afraid, I replied. She looked at me then, really looked at me. You're not who I thought you were, she said. That's not a bad thing, I said gently. No, she agreed. It's not. Inside the dining room, my parents were still seated. The ring remained on the table, catching light from the chandelier. Lily walked back in and picked it up, not to put it back on, but to close her fingers around it. I'm done, she said quietly. Not dramatic, not loud, just done. My father nodded once, slowly. My mother reached for Lily's hand. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the underestimated daughter sitting on the edge of the table. I felt like myself. Not a rival, not a warning, just the one who told the truth. And somehow, in the quiet that followed, that felt like enough. Lily showed up at my hotel the next morning wearing sunglasses and yesterday's dress. She didn't call first. She just knocked. When I opened the door, she stood there for a second like she wasn't sure whether to speak or cry. Can I come in? She asked quietly. I stepped aside without a word. She walked in slowly, sat on the edge of the armchair by the window, and finally took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were swollen, but clear. I didn't sleep, she said. I didn't expect you to, I replied. For a while, neither of us filled the silence. The city hummed below. Chicago traffic, horns, distant sirens. Life continuing, indifferent to engagement rings and broken narratives. He tried to call me all night, she said. He said I embarrassed him, that I let you manipulate me. I folded my arms loosely. And what do you think? She looked down at her hands. I think I ignored things because they were inconvenient. That was honest, more honest than she'd been in years. I liked how confident he was, she continued. How certain. He talked about success like it was already his.
That's easy to do when you're not responsible for it yet, I said. She gave a weak smile. You really are CEO, she said again, like she still needed to test the words. Yes. 3 months, she repeated. 3 months. Mom thought you were barely making payroll. I almost laughed, but it wasn't funny. I let her think that, I admitted. It was easier than arguing. Why? She asked. I walked to the window and looked out at the skyline. Because every time I tried to explain what I was building, it sounded defensive, I said, like I needed their approval. She didn't interrupt. I stopped proving, I continued, and started building. Behind me, I heard her shift in the chair. I compared us, she said softly. All the time. I told myself I was more stable, more realistic. You were stable, I said. That's not a flaw. But I used it as a weapon, she replied. I turned back toward her. We were both reacting to the same pressure, I said. We just chose different paths. She nodded slowly. I don't want to compete with you, she said. You don't have to, I replied. There was another quiet stretch, but this one felt different, not tense, just reflective. Are Mom and Dad mad? She asked finally. They're confused, I said. That's a start. She smiled faintly. Dad called me this morning, she said. He asked what governance policy means. That almost made me laugh. And? I asked. I told him it means rules apply to everyone, she said. I held her gaze. That's exactly what it means. Later that afternoon, I went to see my parents before heading back to Denver. Their house felt smaller than it had when we were kids. My mother hugged me first, not tightly, but sincerely. We didn't know, she said. I know, I replied. My father stood in the doorway to the living room. You built all that? He asked, almost cautiously. Yes. He nodded slowly. I read about the merger, he said. It was impressive. Impressive. That word landed differently than little company ever had. I didn't need you to believe in me, I said carefully. But I did need you not to assume the worst. My mother looked down. We thought we were protecting you from disappointment, she said. I survived disappointment, I replied. What I needed was respect. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't hostile. It was recalibrating. Back in Denver 2 days later, I walked into Heliocore's headquarters and felt the familiar hum of momentum. Engineers moving between glass offices, screens filled with real-time grid analytics, the quiet rhythm of people building something that mattered. This was my world. Not rooftop laughter, not comparison, not curated narratives, Lily called that evening. I updated my resume, she said abruptly. Oh? I removed some inflated language, she admitted. After everything, I didn't want to sound like him. I smiled. That's growth, I said. She hesitated. Can I visit Denver next month? I want to see Heliocore. You're welcome anytime, I replied. There was something lighter in her voice, not defeated, free. As for Ryan, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that his senior strategy role wasn't as senior as he'd presented it to be. Titles can sound bigger in hotel dining rooms than they do in actual boardrooms. I didn't follow up. I didn't need to. For years, I thought revenge meant proving people wrong, loudly. What I learned is that sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it's sitting in the CEO's chair without announcing it.
Sometimes it's letting the truth dismantle the lie without raising your voice. I didn't need my family's validation to lead HelioCore. But when they finally looked at me without pity, without comparison, without the phrase small, self-started company hovering in the air, that felt like a different kind of victory. Not loud, not flashy, just earned. If you've ever been underestimated by the very people who were supposed to know you best, I want to know, did you stay silent or did you let your work speak? Tell me in the comments. And if stories about hidden strength, family drama, and quiet power resonate with you, stay with this channel. There are more truths we haven't told yet.